Hello, my name is Karen Alari, and this is a demo of a painting that I did. This is the finished painting here, and here's the reference photo. This is along the North Umpqua River near Swiftwater Park in Oregon. This is my palette and all the different paints I use. I use golden acrylic paints, and those are the three brushes I'll be using in this painting. A number 4 flat and a number 2 round. Here I am starting with the drawing. I just use Quinacridone Gold, any color works, and my number 2 round bristle. And I'm just looking at my reference photo and laying in the basic shapes just to give myself a roadmap as to where I'm going with this. I'm starting my block in here, and when you're doing the block in, the idea is just to put in the large shapes in the right value. Really the focus here is the right value, meaning lightness and darkness relative to the rest of the shapes that you're doing in the painting. So here I'm comparing. I put in the very background, which is actually a hillside of trees, which is the lightest. And then as I go forward, I'm comparing each color I put on to make sure that it's relative lightness and darkness. That's what really makes the painting look more realistic. We love the color and the color makes it fun, but it's really the value that gives it its realistic look. So beyond doing, I'm just finding the big shapes and the general color that I'm looking for and the value I'm looking for, and just trying to simplify and edit. You can see there I laid in a dark piece in the background, but it was just as dark as my foreground block of trees, so I added some white to lighten it. I'm using acrylic paints so they dry quickly, and I'm able to paint right over what I'm doing, and I don't have to worry about the mixing of the colors because the layers underneath are already dry. The other thing that I'm looking for as I do the block in, besides the value and the big shapes and the relative color, I'm also getting a feeling for my composition and deciding if there's anything that I want to change about the reference photo. And you'll see in a little while here, I actually end up changing that background bank of trees, which was just a hillside, and I decided I was going to put some sky in. So the little bit of water that I have showing is a nice blue color, and I didn't want it to be isolated, so I dropped in a little bit of sky in there too. You can see I'm laying in the reflections and the trees themselves just as one big shape, and then I came back in and added the shoreline in a dark value. Got to remember that everything's relative, so always be asking yourself the question, is this area lighter or darker? And you can see how I changed and adjusted that piece there too. I put it in dark and then I added some white to make it a little lighter. The other thing with acrylics you always have to remember is they will dry darker, a couple shades darker sometimes. So there's my finished block in. I call it the ugly stage. And you can see it's just big blocks of color, and I've focused on the relative values. So now it becomes the process of just refining the painting and putting in the detail, and you can put in as much detail as you want to put in or as little as you want to. Here I'm laying in the background bank of trees, hillside, in a very muted green color in a very light value, trying to match the value that I originally laid down. And you want that area to recede into the background, so it always has to be bluer and it has to be lighter and a little duller in color. In other words, more gray. As you come forward in the painting, the colors will get more chromatic. They'll be less gray, less dull, they'll be just more pure pigment. There I'm putting in I'm watching the direction of my light in the painting. It's coming from the left to the right. So I lay down the dark shapes of the trees, and then I come back in and lay a lighter shape on top on the side that the light would be hitting them. And you can see as I move forward, I can keep mixing darker and darker colors as I come forward, and that makes them be more foreground. The more chromatic, the brighter the colors and the darker the values, the more they will come forward. In the distance, you have less contrast. The lights are darker and the darks are lighter, so there's less contrast. So I'm just continuing to lay in these trees. You notice I use the side of my brush a lot, and I've switched to the round brush. It's a synthetic bristle blend brush, and it's pretty old, and so it's kind of roughed up, and it makes interesting shapes in the trees and in the foliage. As you can see, I roll it and I tap it to get those tree shapes to try to make them look random. Here I'm using my liner brush, and I like to do this. I use it to lay in tree trunks and twigs and branches, but I also like to use it just to add a little bit of chaos in a general tree area like that. And I'm just holding it real lightly and flicking it about. Most of that will be covered up later in the painting, but little bits of it will show through, and I think it adds some movement and some energy to the area and keeps it from looking real static. You notice as I'm going along, I lay in the tree area, and then I lay in underneath it in the reflection area the same colors. Being this is acrylic paint, it's going to dry, so I can't count on being able to do wet on wet like you would with an oil painting and move around the edges of the brush strokes I put down later. You have a little bit of a window, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, where you can adjust your edges, but after that it is what it is, and you can just come back later and go over the top of it, but you're not going to change what you've already put down. But the benefit of that is you also don't get muddy colors, because what's underneath is dry, and you can lay your new color right over the top without it mixing together. So I'm just building up layer on layer of this background area of trees, trying to make it look interesting. I'm not painting any particular leaf shapes or anything like that. I'm just looking at my reference photo, getting a color, squinting at both the reference photo and my painting, and just trying to get the colors and the placement and the general shapes to match my reference photo, and build up layer after layer. Now I'm laying in the area of the shoreline, which this is an area that the sunlight is hitting, so I want it to have a little more focus in the painting. I want your eye to be drawn there, and in order to draw your eye to an area, you need to add more detail, more chroma, the contrasts have to be brighter. All those things will draw your eye to that area. So I'm adding in all those brighter colors and darker darks and lighter lights, and putting in more detail than I would, just little bits of color and suggestions that there's moss on the rocks and little bushes coming up. And there you can see as I put in the new color up in the upper area, I'm going to match that color down in my reflection area and just keep building those reflections as I go. And so in the finished painting, there'll be an equivalent reflection. That's one thing with acrylic paints, is they're also drawing on your palette. I use a wet paper towels underneath a disposable paper palette to keep the paint as wet as I can for as long as possible. But as you mix a color, you can't mix a whole pile of it and then be able to come back 20 minutes later and use it. It'll be dry by then. So as I mix the colors and I put them in the trees, I also put that same color down in the reflections while I still have it. and I'm constantly changing the color, adjusting it a little bit. That's the fun part to me. I love to paint trees because of there's areas a little warmer, a little cooler, darker, lighter, and it's just this constant back and forth until it looks right to me. So I just add a little bit of light. Here I'm adding the little bit of leaves that are left on these fall trees, and then going back in and putting some more of the gray branches, and then coming back in with more of the leaves on top, and it's a process of back and forth, which I find very fun. Here I'm adding some darks and defining the edge of the shoreline a little more. Where the water meets the shore, I add a dark line there. And again, as you can see, I do a lot of rolling of my brush and just little flicks and rolls, and I'm very lightly touching the canvas at this point. I've built up enough layers now that as I roll my brush along, it touches the tops of layers and skips in certain places, and that gives you this feeling of branches coming in and leaves and twigs. I added those white tree trunks over there to the right that I see in my reference photo. I just wanted to make sure I got that relative lightness, and I'll come back later and put more leaves over the top of them and blend that back in a little bit. There we go. So it's just this process of going along and looking at my reference photo, mixing a color, adding a little bit. Of course, I've edited out the mixing time. A lot of what you're doing when you're painting is mixing the next color that's coming along. And adding some more interest in my area of focal point there where I want the eye to go, and so I'm adding more detail to get that area of rocks, mossy rocks that hit the shore there with the sunlight hitting them, and there's some more sunlight hitting on the tops of the rocks, lightening up the moss that's growing on them. Some sunlit bushes and twigs and colors in there. So it's just back and forth, which you can do with acrylics because it's dry underneath, so I can keep working back and forth, building up texture, building up layers, building up a sense that there's something going on behind there, which is always fun. Working on my reflections a little bit more. All right, just about done with that back bank at this point. Just looking at it and cleaning up the shoreline a little bit, get that water in there. Now I'm starting to work on the big trees, and again, this is the foreground, and I'm just starting to lay down layers. You want to be loose and just lay them down. Here I'm laying down the edge of the trees where they're going to overlap. And later in the painting I will go back and actually lighten the trees behind them, because as you can see, the foreground trees aren't really coming forward enough. The back is a little bit too chromatic and a little bit too dark. It's not receding well, that line of green trees. But right now I'm just flicking in the branches, keeping my brush loose, rolling in some of the orange colors, trying to make these colors darker than the ones in the back, because this area is in shadow. So though these are the same types of trees that are showing on this right side bank, the colors are going to be darker because they're in shadow. This whole side of the river here is in shadow and the light is hitting the far bank. So that's the end of part 1, and I hope you'll join me for part 2.